The current manner in which activism is done does not aid in conservation efforts, but in fact impedes development of sustainable systems. Now hold on, eager activists. I'm not some climate change denying politician here to ruin your day. I'm simply performing a little thought experiment. Let's start with this. This conference was built upon the ideas of critical thinking communities, or CTCs. What are CTCs? Well, instead of giving a long-winded definition, how about I show you? One of the base skills of critical thought is analysis of one's own thinking patterns. So let's do just that. Let's think about how we think. Odd, yes, but this is a critical aspect of higher order thinking, so bear with me for a moment. I'm sure you remember the statement made earlier, right? Now I'm sure you've got an opinion already primed since the moment you heard it. Assessing and interpreting information as quickly as possible is a vital skill, and your personal lens is the only window you have to frame the world, so obviously it's going to be used. However, if we don't take a moment every now and then to stop and reassess the woodwork of those frames, we can rush forward with incomplete ideas. So, how do we assess that frame? Take a moment to look back at how you think. Remove yourself from your own skin and don't be afraid to give yourself a thorough criticism. Why did you respond to the statement how you did? If it made you angry, are you angry because you found a fallacy in that statement? Or because you've unconsciously found a fallacy in yourself? Are you uncomfortable yet? Good. Finding and acknowledging the flaws in our own ways of thinking, as uncomfortable as it may be, gives us the opportunity to buff them out and refine our lens. Christopher Hitchens said it best. The essence of the independent mind lies not in what it thinks, but in how it thinks. So, hopefully I've properly introduced the concept behind this event. This is not about how to cope with industries turning our green into their gold, nor arguing over lawmakers with Ben Franklin stuffed in their ears. This is about us, our lives, our lifestyles, and our own thoughts. Bring your own brain.
I'd like to welcome everyone back to our last day of the symposium. We're going to get started here. I'd like to introduce Rains to talk about our first speaker.
It is my honor to introduce Kate Raworth. Kate is a radical economist whose research focuses on the economic mindset needed to face the 21st century challenge of meeting the needs of all within the means of the planet. Her internationally acclaimed idea of doughnut economics has been widely influential among sustainable development thinkers, progressive businesses, and political activists, and she has presented this idea to audiences ranging from the UN General Assembly to the Occupy movement. Kate is a senior visiting research associate teaching at Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute and a senior associate of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Over the last 2 decades, Kate has worked as senior researcher at Oxfam, as a co-author of the UN's Human Development Report of the United Nations Development Program, and as a fellow of the Overseas Development Institute in Zanzibar. Please give a warm welcome for Kate Raworth.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you, and I want to start by saying congratulations, because I think what you're doing is very, very smart. A lot of people write to me and to many other people working in this area saying, we're organizing a conference, it's going to be next year, we've got our budget, can we fly you over? And then you go through a whole series of hassle about the flight and the transport and the hotel, and it burns a heck of a lot of carbon because we want to get together and talk about burning carbon, and we do it in the process. And I bet you wouldn't get half the number of speakers who you've got joining you today. So I think what you're doing is really smart, and using these extraordinary technologies we have. Yes, I'm not in the room. I'm not actually there to shake your hand, or, you know, we could have a cup of tea or coffee afterwards. And of course that human touch makes a difference. But my goodness, this is close, right? This is close. I'm sitting in my little office in my house in East Oxford in England on a Friday afternoon, and I can join you on a Montana Friday morning. And I think that's extraordinary. And we're very lucky to have this technology to connect us. And it's only through this kind of jumping and willingness to let go of old ways and jump into new ways that actually we start to make great leaps and bounds in our understanding and our connectivity. So I really congratulate you for having the initiative to do this. And I think the initiative and drive that you guys have shown in putting together this conference is the reason why so many big names like Bill McKibben, Naomi Klein, George Monbiot are, joining in with you because they're recognizing what you're doing. So kudos to you lot. I want to kick off today. I want to share two things with you today. First of all, I'd like to talk about the Doughnut itself. And then I'd also like to tell you what I've done with it over the last 3 years and taken it back to the roots of economics. So I'm going to introduce ideas from the roots of economics. And we're going to have a bit of discussion back and forth. So I'll introduce the Doughnut, we'll do some discussion together, and then I'll go on and talk about the economics. I hope that works, and plenty of time for discussing at the end. So I'm really looking forward to this. And I'm just going to jump in. I'm going to jump in. So, my screen, why is my screen frozen? Whoa. Okay. A few years ago, the president of France called together a commission of the great and the good in economics. And he said, we need to come up with new measures of our societies, of macroeconomic progress. And they looked at all the measures. And one of the strongest things that came out of the report that was put together by these leading Nobel Memorial Prize winning economists Joseph Stiglitz and Amartya Sen, two very great fine minds. One of the strongest conclusions is this quote, which I love. Those attempting to guide the economy and our societies are like pilots trying to steer without a reliable compass. Why do they say that? Because everybody knows that GDP, gross domestic product, as a measure, may be the dominant measure in the news, may be the dominant measure by which governments assess themselves, but it falls far short of what drives us to a future that we actually want. So what would it look like if we could put a compass into policymakers' hands, into business leaders' hands, into community activists' hands, a compass that shapes and tells us where we are and where we want to go? What would that compass show? This is a question that's obsessed me ever since the days when I first studied economics at university 25 years ago. And I set out to try and draw a new compass. And in doing so, I was deeply inspired by a quote from a wonderful American innovator from last century. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, Buckminster Fuller, who said, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. I love that quote because sometimes the best form of protest is to propose something new. It's all very good being critical, and indeed academia often encourages us to specialize in critiquing what others have put forward. But the richness that comes, the excitement and the vulnerability that comes when you propose something new. I'm told that you were watching Naomi Klein's video about shock and Trump, and one of her plan was that we need a new vision of a plan we want to be for. So the work I'm doing is in aspiration towards that, contributing to a bigger narrative that many, many people are building towards. And I wanted to be part of building that new story. So what I'm going to present to you today is a compass and part of that new economic story. So here's the compass that I propose for the 21st century. And odd though it sounds, ridiculous though it sounds, it looks like a donut. Let me tell you what's going on here. In the middle of that donut, the hole in the middle, that's a place where people are falling short on life's essentials. Be it food, healthcare, water, access to energy, housing, political voice, income, education. These are the essentials for life for which every human being has a claim for their dignity, their opportunity and community. So we want to get everybody out of that hole in the middle and over what I've called a social foundation. And if you're wondering, well, where did those 12 social dimensions come from? I actually crowdsourced them from the world's governments who put them out as the social priorities in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So you could say that these 12 dimensions here are the most contemporary international statement of what's commonly agreed across countries as a decent basis of a bare minimum for human well-being. It's a modern statement of human rights in some sense. So we want to get everybody out of that hole in the middle and into the donut space itself. And yet we cannot afford to push beyond the donut's outer crust, because there we put so much pressure on Earth's life-giving systems that we begin to kick this extraordinary living planet out of kilter. And we begin to undermine the very living systems on which our well-being fundamentally depends. We cause climate change, which is what brought you together in the first place. We cause ocean acidification, air pollution, chemical pollution, convert so much of the Earth's surface into human use that it makes it incredibly vulnerable and unable to perform these other functions. Biodiversity loss, excessive nutrient loading, ozone layer depletion, withdraw too much water from Earth's rivers and lakes that we actually change the flow of the hydrological cycle. These 9 dimensions you can see on the outside of the donut, they're known as the 9 planetary boundaries. And they were created in 2009 by a group of leading Earth system scientists who said, look at our planet. For the last 11,000 years, it's been in the most extraordinary, stable and benevolent state for human well-being. What is it about the current state of the planet that keeps it in this wonderful stability? And between them, they identified these 9 processes that they call planetary boundaries. These are 9 critical Earth system processes that we must keep all of them in a balance, interdependent as they are. Because if we put too much pressure on any one of them, it could kick that system out of kilter, but also begin to have knock-on effects on other parts of Earth's life systems. And of course, it has knock-on effects on us. If you take just climate change alone, climate change will affect biodiversity loss. It has impacts on the land conversion. It will increase water shortages, but also it has huge implications on human well-being, on our access to food, to water, energy, health, on even children's access to education, certainly on political voice, on gender equality. So these things are deeply interwoven. And as you look at this donut, if your desire is to pick up a pencil and draw lots of arrows that connect these different segments, then you've got the right idea. Because, of course, if we drew all of the arrows on, it would start to look more like a bowl of spaghetti than a donut. So we can't draw them all on top, but we know that there are very rich interactions between all these dimensions. So I put this forward as a compass for human well-being this century, because I believe our generational challenge and our goal must be to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet, to ensure that nobody is left falling short on life's essentials, and yet we don't overshoot our pressure on our collective home. So that's the goal. The question obviously is, where are we now? And that is striking, because currently we are far below the social foundation and simultaneously beyond the planetary ceiling. Many millions of people worldwide, in countries rich and poor, fall short on life's essentials, be it having not enough access to food, falling short on education, certainly on political voice, on gender equality, on decent housing, access to networks, be it internet networks or even networks of social support. So, for example, on food there, that red wedge shows you the 11% of people in the world who don't have enough to eat every day. They're the undernourished community. And if everybody had enough to eat, that red wedge would disappear back into the green area. On water, you can see 2 different segments. One shows you 9% of people in the world who don't have access to improved water sources. And the other one shows you the 32% of people, almost 1 in 3, who don't have access to what we would consider a toilet. So some of these segments measure with 1 indicator and some of them measure with 2. They're all illustrative of human well-being worldwide, or indeed human shortfalls on well-being. And yet we can see we're falling short on every single one of those. And we've already gone over at least 4 planetary boundaries on climate change. That ecological ceiling is set at 350 parts per million, the same as Bill McKibben's 350. And yet we know in April this year, we already surpassed 410 parts per million. But also we're massively over on excessive fertilizer use in the terms of nitrogen and phosphorus loading, massively over on biodiversity loss, and also on land conversion. We have converted too much of Earth's surface for human use, whether it's for agriculture or building cities or highways. And we're making the planet vulnerable to other changes in the system. And we don't even know where we are on air pollution and chemical pollution. We could even be over 6 of these planetary boundaries. This picture with the needles showing red on our compass, to me, this is the statement of humanity, the state of our world and us at the outset of the 21st century. And it's a very confronting image to see. I believe at this rate, we are going to go down as the era of reckless overshoot. That's how our children's children will remember us. Not for Trump, not for Brexit, not for wars with Mexico or even wars with Palestine. They will remember us for being the generation that could have done something to bring this planet back into balance, but didn't. Can we turn that legacy around? I believe this is the fundamental question facing our generation, and we know it's a big one. You know it's a big one, which is why you've got yourselves together in this conference. Can we turn that legacy around? Well, in thinking about that, we can think about it at many, many different levels. What if each one of us put our own lives on this table and asked ourselves, how does the way I live impact humanity's ability to move into the donut? How does the way I shop, eat, travel? How does the way I bank, I invest, I divest, I vote, I volunteer? How does the way I teach or influence my peers, persuade my neighbors, mobilize in my community? All of these ways are part of our impact on the donut. And again, of course, this conference is contributing here because we are sharing knowledge, we're building our knowledge networks without adding massively to carbon emissions through everybody traveling to be with you. So this conference is a really nice example of action that helps bring humanity into the donut rather than pushes us out. What if city planners designed the future cities around this donut idea and said, how do we meet the needs of all within the means of the cities that we're building? Well, I created this slide a few years ago, and so I was absolutely delighted when I was contacted by city planners who said, we're doing this. I was contacted by folks in Sweden who said, we're creating a new district of Stockholm, about 15 minutes by train from downtown Stockholm. You can see it on their photograph there. It's going to be built on a greenfield site, and we're using your donut as the blueprint, asking ourselves, how do we meet the needs of all the inhabitants of this new suburb within the means of the planet, respecting the ecosystem into which we're building and respecting all the services and the functioning that ecosystem does? They've even said they're going to call these new city districts donut districts. And people laughing, saying, you know, Homer Simpson's going to want to move in. So I'm not quite sure what I've done to the world by calling everything a donut, but it's fun and it's obviously catching on. I also was contacted by city planners in South Africa who said, we are thinking about the future of an existing town that's growing uncontrolledly at the moment. It's called Kokstad, the fastest growing town in KwaZulu-Natal. And instead of just letting it sprawl, we want to think actively, what is our vision for the future of our town? How could we meet the needs of all within the means of the planet? And they brought together the municipality and the youth of the town to work on creating their own vision within this donut. And my favorite thing is that the youth of the town said, we need to add one thing to the social foundation. We need to add in fun, because it should be fun transforming your economy, which I think is absolutely right. What if every company in the world drew up its corporate strategy sitting around this table and asked itself, how do our products, how do the supply chains that we create have an impact on humanity's ability to get into this safe and just space? Is our business actually pushing humanity out of this space? Are we paying below a living wage? Are we sacking women when they get pregnant? Are we draining the ground of the water resources from the nearby community? Are we causing climate change and actually putting too much fertilizer in the soils because of the way we're producing our products? Or is our core business and our core product actually helping bring humanity into this space? And the more I meet companies and people who work for companies that are doing that, the more they're the folks you see with light in their eyes, because they know that they have a bigger mission merely than what their company produces. They are helping to contribute to a brighter future for all of us. What if the world's finance ministers and governments met around this table? This is a picture of the G20 finance ministers meeting, which took place in St. Petersburg in 2014. Now, I don't want to kid you, they didn't actually meet around this donut table. That's just a Photoshop picture. But just imagine if they did. Just imagine if they did and how that would change their conversation. Here's the world's finance ministers, and they would be asking themselves, how do we create a financial system, the regulations, the international design, such that finance is in service to an economy that's in service to life? That, I think, is a profound question for financiers to ask themselves, and it would take us to a very, very different financial system than the one we have today. So I want to pull back to the diagram. We've looked from the individual to the company to the city to the financial system. But let's pull back and look at this whole diagram. And I want to put a question to you all, because it's a question that people sometimes bring to me. How do you even know this green space exists? How do you know there's any space between meeting the social foundation for everybody in the world and being able to do so within the means of the planet? And what determines whether or not there's a space there? So I put this question to you to discuss in the room, to discuss with whoever you're with if you're watching this by live stream. What are the key factors that determine whether or not humanity can live in the donut? And I'm going to give you 4 minutes to talk to the folks next to you. And I want you to try to come up, whatever ideas first come to you, try to think, what actually is that? Try to reason it out until the answers you come up with are so big that they're just one word. So you're going to come back with answers that are so big, so high in the level of thinking that they're just one word long. And then I might ask you to contribute, just say a sentence about why you came up with that one idea. Let's see if we can do that with folks jumping up and coming up to the microphone when we've had the discussion. So you have 4 minutes. What determines whether or not humanity can live in the donut? 4 minutes to come up with 8 big ideas. Go. You have 1 more minute. Come up with one new idea.
you've got people just buzzing. This whole week's kind of critical thinking exercise, so people love this. So getting better.
Excellent. Great. Okay, well, let's go. So I want folks to come up to the microphone, tell me the big word, and then maybe just one sentence as to why.
I was going to offer class.
Go for it. Do it however it works.
Yeah, I think that the word I was thinking of is class. I think that there's a concern I have that, when you mention companies, I'm wondering if we can use the language of cooperatives instead of companies, because companies still imply a class division, and to move into that center donut, I just don't know how we can get there without addressing class. So I think for me, I was just hoping to, talk about a different business model, or even an economic model. So cooperatives maybe through, a way to work on class.
Okay, and I like that. And maybe to use a more neutral word than companies, let's talk about enterprise, because it could be a cooperative or a company. Would that work for you if we talk about enterprise?
Sure, we can try that.
Yeah, okay. So class is one. Okay. Anybody else got one?
Okay. Oh, hi, thanks. I was working with John, two Johns. John number one said thoughtfulness and action, because we're talking about processes. And the key word for him was stewardship, caring for people, the earth, and the larger community. And perhaps following Jay, I wrote politics and power, political organization into social movements and some new kind of party, which is my special hobby horse. And my key word, therefore, was education.
Great. Okay, cool. What else have we got?
We said mindset because we kind of see that as basically the first step to making any sort of shift like this.
Great.
I don't know, just being able to think communally and planet-oriented, if you will.
Great. Anybody else?
Hi, Kate. Preston and I are here from the student group, and our group came up with the idea of geography.
People in America aren't feeling the direct pressures of climate change as much as people are, say, on the coast of Bangladesh. So that was our example.
Great. Okay. Lovely. Anybody else?
Yeah.
What's
okay.
going to determine it? Yeah.
Yeah. My name is Richard Smith. Kate, the key thing, it seems to me, here is private property. Why? Because you suggest that companies, I want to know how companies like ExxonMobil, Monsanto, British Airways, General Motors can change from destroying the world to saving the world. These companies are owned by private shareholders. They have to make a profit. They must make a profit. That overrides all other considerations. So they must sell more oil, not less, more chemicals, more air flights, more cars. I just don't see how these companies can move into the donut and at the same time be responsible to their shareholders.
Great.
Hey Kate, I'm Alex Simmons, and I think one key factor is population. I think there's too many people in the world to be sustainable. So, yeah.
Great. Thanks, Alex.
Hi, Kate. My word is democracy. People feeling like they should and can get involved with the process of their government and make a difference in it.
Fantastic. Any more for any more?
Yeah, we've got three more.
Oh, great.
Or more.
So I'm Kim. Our word was appetites because it works with donuts really well, but also because we have to limit our upper and lower appetites limits. So
lovely.
Hi, Kate. My name's Kenny. The word me and my friend came up with was culture, as it's really the one thing that informs our really wants and needs, informs our identities, and just it's what we gather and what we learn from other people. It's what we mimic. So if you change the culture, you can change a great deal of things.
Great. Thank you, Kenny.
Hello, my word was soil. It's a integral part of all of our ecology. It's the thing that can get the most new minds involved in helping us figure out how we're going to deal with all these huge problems if we were to get people enough food. And it's just something that I don't hear enough people in climate change zones talking about. How are we going to grow food in a way that's sustainable and not desertify our planet?
Great, thank you. I was in a meeting in London yesterday, and I'm sure you know the work of Nikki Silvestri. She was there talking about soil, so the message is there. Hi.
Hi, Kate. My name's Ashley, and I'm part of the student group here. And our word was community, or a sense of community, and I feel like that can apply to a lot of different things, both in a vague sense, such as being empathetic towards others, and also very literal things on your donut, perhaps land space and housing. In a sense of community, I feel like people can get together more closely.
Fantastic. Is there anybody else? Oh, yep, another one. Hello.
Hello, Kate. I'm Sandra, and our word was leadership, just recognition by leadership that humanity needs to get into the donut.
Great.
And accountability, because we have these measures, and if, number one, we don't measure accurately or know what we're supposed to be measuring, then we're lost. But if we game the system like VW, then all of our great plans will not mean anything.
Okay, the line is done, so you can continue.
Fantastic. So the lovely thing for me when we do this is I immediately know the politics in the room, and you guys, of course, are extremely politically savvy, and you're going for very high level and politically framed concepts, which shows that you've obviously been having a fantastic conference today, because your political savvy antennae are way up. So really great points. I would love to discuss each one of them, but instead what I'm going to do is, well, I'm going to show you a slide that I've made in advance, because I asked this question to many groups, and some of the words and some of the issues that you've brought up today come up again and again. Of course they should. So I'm just going to show, these are some of the ways that it often gets framed, comes up again and again. So right there I put on the top population. Alex mentioned that. The reason I put population there at the top is because if I don't mention it, there's always somebody very angry in the room who says, you haven't talked about population, as if I'm afraid to talk about population. So I always put it right there, because it matters, but many other things matter too. If you think about it, if we want to get everybody in the world over the social foundation, then population does matter, because if we're 7 billion, it takes a certain amount of energy and resource use. If we're 10 billion, it takes more. If we were 20 billion of us, it would take a lot more. So it's going to have an influence. So it certainly matters, but we need to pair it up with what we can see on the other side, which is, I've framed it as inequality. Several of you were bringing up inequality issues in more nuanced ways, whether it's the inequality of impacts via geography, or the inequality of business ownership, or indeed inequality of incomes. So you've got to look at population and inequality together when we look at humanity's consumption impacts on the world as it is today. But of course, those are also framed by technology. That didn't quite come up in the discussion. I'm sure it would have if we'd gone a few steps further, but the technologies we use obviously matter. How we turn the available water resources into ensuring that everybody has enough water, how we generate energy, how we, as the gentleman talking about soil, how we grow foods. Technology, whether it's high tech or the deep know-how of communities, these are technologies that we've used and developed, and the technologies used make a big impact, obviously, on our ability to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. And I've got that paired on the other side with governance, which just one word that could be used in this space, but several of you talked about it. Sandra talked about leadership, Ashley talked about community, others talked about accountability. And I think all these are, and somebody talked about democracy, these are dimensions, these are actually richer words that you're bringing through than governance, which in some way embodies all of it. It's about how we collectively bring ourselves together and agree on rules and systems and norms, and indeed corporate governance. What I really like Robert's point about company models. What kind of model of business or of enterprise enables an enterprise to actually work towards getting the donut? I think that's a key question, which we can come back and touch on later. Kim talked about appetites. Kenny talked about culture, and I think those both contribute to what I've got here is framed as aspiration. What do we believe is enough? What do people believe is seen as a good life? How do we think it's normal to live? How do we do things around here? These all shape our aspirations and our norms. But also education. And I'm sorry I didn't catch the name of the person who said it's about politics, it's about power, and that's why I'm going to say it's about education. And also the person who followed him saying mindsets. I deeply agree it's about those. It is also, of course, about time. Because I showed you the diagram that we're over planetary boundaries and many people are falling short on life's essentials. We are exceeding planetary boundaries, and there is, of course, a deep unknown question, which is for how long can you exceed planetary boundaries before that excess actually kicks us over tipping points beyond which we no longer have that chance. That's why I said earlier, our children's children will remember us as a generation that could do something about it, but did we do something in time? So there's the time we can spend beyond planetary boundaries, but there's also the time it takes to transform our governments, to transform our education systems, to create new technologies, to transform our cultures and sense of aspiration. So how does time play into this? As you can see, I've left the last one blank because every group brings up something rich that isn't quite captured in here. And what I'm hearing from you guys, which you're saying more than many other groups I speak with, it's a real political awareness. So I'm going to say that space is held by power, class, politics, and the questioning of deeply held property relations, because that was a very strong message coming out of your group. We could spend the whole session talking through each of these, and we could take ourselves into deep debates on each one. I wanted to put them there because I wanted to show that it's not a given that humanity can live in this space. There are many different debates that feed into it. But for the rest of our session, I want to take it down what's framed here as education, or as the young man said, mindsets, because that's the one that's obsessed me. And that once I'd drawn this diagram and realized its power and that the resonance it had in the world, I wanted to use it to go back and question the education I'd received that always made me too embarrassed to call myself an economist. And so I'm going to dive into that now. What I'm going to do is present to you the presentation that I've given to many different communities. I've given this same presentation at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. I've given it at cool Busboys and Poets Cafe, very cool gatherings in D.C. I've given it at NGOs and community groups around the world. So I'm going to tell you my takedown of economics, and this is really the heart of the message of my book. And then let's have a discussion afterwards. So I'm going to speak for quite a while now, for maybe about 30 minutes. I hope that's okay, because I really want to convey to you the core message of my book. I wrote a book in order to be able to give a full explanation of my ideas, but my passion isn't about selling books. My passion is about communicating ideas. So I'm very happy that people will be able to download articles from the web or hear me talk about it, convey the core ideas to you now. So I'm going to jump in and do that, because I want to go back to economics departments. This is where my journey of looking at this donut takes me. I studied economics at university 25 years ago. And as I said earlier, before we began, I was deeply frustrated by what I was taught, because I believed that the issues I was learning about and that I cared about, the reason I studied economics is because I wanted to change the world. Who doesn't want to change the world? And I believed that learning economics would give me the mother tongue of public policy to do that. And yet the issues that I cared most about, like social justice and environmental integrity, were pushed to the sidelines of the theory and the focus of what we were studying. And the living world was talked about it in terms of externalities. Well, if you're going to talk about the living world in terms of externalities, you've already told me how important it isn't. So I was deeply unpersuaded by the language and the framing of economics. And so I decided to walk away. I decided to immerse myself in real world challenges. So I worked for 3 years in the villages of Zanzibar with barefoot entrepreneurs. I worked for 4 years at the United Nations writing the Human Development Report and thinking about a big vision of what human prosperity looks like. I worked for a decade on the front lines of campaigning with Oxfam. I became a mother of twins and immersed myself in the unpaid household economy and really understood the gender politics of that for the first time. And through all of this, I realized the obvious thing, which is you can't walk away from economics because it frames the world we live in. And that if I wanted to have an impact in these spaces I was working, making change in these ways, I realized I wanted to walk back towards economics and then flip it on its head and rewrite economics so that it's fit for the challenges of our century, not left framed by people who died hundreds of years ago. And if they were here, they would rewrite it themselves. So that's the journey I've been on. Because I believe at the heart of 20th century economics is a handful of diagrams that wordlessly whisper to us the questions in economics that never actually explicitly get asked. And so these diagrams slip into the back of our heads and linger in our visual cortexes long after any words or equations have faded. They sit like visual graffiti on our minds, framing and limiting and shaping what we can see and perceive about the world. And it was only through drawing the Doughnut diagram, which was published in 2012, that I realized this power of pictures. I was so struck by the number of people who said, I love this diagram because now I can open up new conversations. It challenges old thinking. And I'm thinking, it's just a picture. Why is a picture so powerful? And it made me realize it was because it was laying over old paradigm pictures. And so we need to, if we're going to tell a new economic story, we need to tell it with new pictures. So I'm going to tell you the story of 20th century economics with pictures and then replace them with new 21st century pictures. So whether or not you've studied economics, these diagrams are influencing you because they shape the way we all think and talk about the economy, whether it's in politics, in the media, in business, in communities. And so we need to out these diagrams that are wordlessly shaping our minds, realize their flaws, realize their caveats, and allow ourselves to move beyond them and paint over them. As I said at the beginning, sometimes the best form of protest is to propose something new. So what I'm going to do is show you my protest against the 20th century economics and then invite you to join me in the proposition of a 21st century economics. And what I'm going to present you is the beginning of a new story. So we could have on this discussion of these old pictures, as I said earlier, they wordlessly tell us some of the most important answers to the most important questions that never explicitly get asked in economics. Questions like, what is the economy and what is it for? How does it work and who are we? And I think we could have no better guide to answering these questions and looking at the real answers that lie silently behind them than this gentleman. This is Paul Samuelson. And he taught at the Massachusetts Institute for Technology in the 1940s. And he wrote the world's first real bestseller economics textbook called simply Economics, published in 1948. It is the mother of all economics textbooks that have come ever since. Now, today, many professors, and I know there's some professors in the room, they'll tell you this is true, that professors don't usually get points and kudos for writing textbooks. It's not seen as a high-grade activity. But Samuelson knew the power of doing this. As he said, I don't care who writes a nation's laws or crafts its advanced treaties, so long as I can write its economics textbooks. My favorite thing is what he says next. The first lick is the privileged one, impinging on the beginner's tabula rasa at its most impressionable state. So folks, you better watch out because Paul Samuelson thinks your mind is a blank slate and he wants to lick it. Yeah. And of course he has already licked it because he drew and because he was teaching engineering students, he made it easy for them. So he drew it looking like a radiator system. So what you can see here is what he's called business and public. We would call for public, we would now call that households. And you can see the water being pumped in and it flows around and around, water acting as income. So households earn wages from business and those wages they use for consumption. And so the money goes around and around. This was a very important diagram in its time for showing the insight of John Maynard Keynes, which is that when you pump new money into the economy, it circulates around and around. There's a multiplier effect. So it was a valuable diagram in its time. But it's changed since the 1940s, but only very little. Today it looks like this. Any student of mainstream economics will know this as the circular flow of income diagram. So what we've got going on at the heart of this diagram is the essential market relationship between business and households, where households exchange their labor for wages, and those wages they use for consumer spending to buy goods and services. So the money goes round and round, and so do the goods and services. And that's the market at the heart of it. Then we've got some leakages of money being drawn off by banks, by government, and by trade, but re-injected as savings and as taxes and imports. So it's essentially closed. It's a self-contained circular model, just like a radiator system. And what it does show us is everything that's monetized. What could possibly go wrong with using this diagram as the biggest picture that any mainstream economist can show you today of the economy? Because this is the biggest thing they've got. What could go wrong? It makes absolutely no mention of the living world. No mention of all the materials and resources that are drawn daily into the economy and spewed out as waste and pollution. It makes no mention of the unpaid caring work of parents, all the cooking, shopping, sweeping, cleaning, washing up, raising the kids, doing it all again tomorrow. All of that work that goes unpaid that creates labor, fresh and ready for work every day. And it makes no mention of the commons, which is that place where people, communities get together without using the market, without using the state, but through self-organizing and creating goods and services that they value. So this diagram is silent on the living world, on the unpaid care economy, and on the commons, three of the actually most fundamental sources of our well-being. And those silences will come back to bite us. If Samuelson got to define what the economy is, what about who we are? Well, that, of course, comes from Adam Smith, but his reputation is undeserved because Smith recognized that self-interest is valuable for making markets work, but our interest in others is essential for making society work. And he celebrated our sense of public spirit, our generosity, our sense of justice, and our sense of what he called sympathy, and today we would call empathy. So Smith had a nuanced picture of humanity. The trouble with nuance in economics is that it gets in the way of modeling. So when future economists came along, like John Stuart Mill, and they wanted to create a character of humanity that goes at the heart of the economic model, they just plucked out that one trait of self-interest that makes markets work. As Mill said, political economy does not treat the whole of man in society, nor the whole of his nature, but just as a being who desires to possess wealth. That's who economics tells us we are. And in fact, the character now at the heart of economics, who we know as rational economic man, he's never actually drawn in the textbooks, but if he were, he'd have to look something like this. He'd be a man, standing alone, money in his hand, ego in his heart, calculator in his head, and nature at his feet. He hates work, he loves luxury, and he knows the price of everything. And the challenge, the trouble with this character is not just how absurdly narrow a depiction of us it is. The problem with him is what looking at him does to us. Because on being told that he is like us, we actually become more like him. Research in the US and in Israel has found that the more that economic students learn about this character, rational economic man, the more self-interested they become. They value self-interest and they give less regard to traits such as compassion and altruism. So what began as a model of man actually turns into a model for man, and we begin to mirror these traits of rational economic man because we're told that it's not rational to behave in other ways. Now, we're going to be more than 10 billion people on this planet this century. And if we continue to imagine and conduct and justify ourselves as rational economic man, I think we stand very, very little chance of thriving together. What about how the economy works? Okay, those of you in the room, and I'm going to bet there's some of you in the room who have studied Econ 101. Can you shout out, what is the first diagram that you learn in economics? Say it again. Supply and demand. It's the same damn answer in every damn classroom around the world. So let's ask ourselves where that diagram came from. Well, in the 1870s, a small group of economists wanted to make economics a science as reputable as physics. And they were awed by the science of Isaac Newton, who had discovered the physical laws of motion. And so when economists such as William Stanley Jevons began to draw their economics diagrams, they drew them just like Newton. Do you see how similar Jevons's diagram is to Newton's diagram? Newton's picture is a picture of gravity pulling a moving object to rest. Jevons's diagram is the demand curve, and it's the fundamentals of what we now call the supply and demand curve, the very first diagram that economics students are taught. Right there, in lesson 1, students are told economics, oh, it's the market, and the market it is in equilibrium. 2 falsehoods in one sentence. The problem with this is, as we all know from the 2008 financial crisis, that using gravity as a model for the way the economy behaves is really not a very good metaphor. because markets don't behave like gravity. They don't return to equilibrium. But the economists in the beginning, they wanted to mimic the language of Newton. And so they said, just as gravity pulls a moving object to rest, so markets and prices pull a market into equilibrium. And they talked about the market mechanism, market forces, market equilibrium. You can hear in that language, when you listen to it fresh, you can hear that Newtonian physics. Well, the trouble is, the Newtonian physics turns out to be false because markets don't behave like balls being pulled to rest by gravity. But the two far worse problems out of it, the two really pernicious effects of this desire to be like Newtonian physics, which is that economists want to discover economic laws of motion. Just as Newton had discovered the physical laws of motion, they want to discover the economic laws of motion. And two of them have had extraordinary influence in our societies for the last decades. So the first one was created by Simon Kuznets in 1955. Kuznets had data on inequality as countries get richer for the UK, the US, and Germany. And he plotted the scant data that he had on a graph. And he said, I think I see a pattern. I think over time, as economies get richer, that first inequality increases, but then it decreases. And the next thing Kuznets says is, I wouldn't expect this. This goes against my intuition. I would expect the rich to get richer, not the poor to catch up. But he tried to explain it by saying perhaps it's something to do with rural to urban migration, for which he had no justification, but he was hypothesizing, trying to understand this curve. He also said, I have 5% data, 95% speculation, and probably some wishful thinking. And it would be terrible if this became an unwarranted dogmatic generalization. Poor Simon Kuznets, because of course that's exactly what happened, and the power of pictures is part of the story, because once this got drawn and is known by every economist as the Kuznets curve, then it starts to whisper this mantra in the back of our heads, which is, you care about inequality? Well, when it comes to inequality, it has to get worse before it will get better, and growth will make it better. This diagram justifies trickle-down economics. It justifies austerity economics. It justifies tax cuts for the rich, because it tells us that inequality needs to get worse before things will get better. It was actually in 2014 when the work of Thomas Piketty, with a full data set on these countries, could say, actually, I now understand what happened here. Kuznets was right. This is what the data was showing, but for extraordinary reasons, because in the 1950s, he was measuring the economies after an extraordinary phase. What that downturn in the curve is capturing is the loss of capital of the rich during the wars, and it's reflecting the rise of the New Deal, the welfare state in the UK, so massive government investment. It's government investment and war that makes that curve bend down, not the inherent workings of capitalism. So that's the fuller story. And Kuznets, if he were alive today, he'd say that this makes sense to me, and we would rewrite the story. But the picture has taken root, and it still has power, even though it's being debunked. And just as it was being debunked in the 1990s, when people were realizing actually this story ain't so watertight as it appears, a new picture came on the scene, which looks uncannily similar to the first one. So similar, they didn't even bother to give it its own name. They called it the environmental Kuznets curve. This was created in the 1990s by economists Krugman and Grossman and Kruger, who had data on local air and water pollution for a number of countries. And they said, we think we see a pattern that over time, as economies get richer, first pollution increases and then it decreases. So stop your alarmist environmental cries, because if you care about the environment, it has to get worse before it gets better, and growth will make it better. Like a well-trained child, growth will apparently clean up after itself. Except, of course, we know it doesn't. Not even on local air and water pollutions. In London, children are not being allowed to play in their playgrounds because the air pollution from diesel cars is so extreme. But when we look even beyond local pollutants, and they gave the caveat, they said we only have local pollution, but when we look beyond that to global carbon dioxide emissions, to biodiversity loss, to deforestation, this curve does not automatically bend down. In effect, there is no economic law of motion. These are not necessary phases of capitalist development that will take you to a happy, more equal, more green future when you go through a tricky path. These are not economic laws of motion. It's a design choice, and we need to think about it in terms of economic design. Lastly, even though that physics turned out to be fake, the wonderful justification it gave in the process was a justification for pursuing GDP growth, because it promised that growth will even things up and it will clean things up. And this story again comes back to Simon Kuznets, a poor man at the heart of 20th century economics, brilliant economist, because he was asked in the 1930s by US Congress to come up with a measure of national income for the first time, one number that tells us the size of the economy. And he did. And when he created this national measure of income, he said, this can scarcely be used to infer a nation's welfare, because it doesn't count the unpaid care economy. It doesn't count all the value of goods created by a community. And it's just a flow measure. It doesn't tell you what's happening to the stocks underneath. So Simon Kuznets gave us all the caveats from day one. But we put them aside because policymakers so enamored of having this single number that you could then measure on year on year on year. And then when you could compare yourself, the US to the USSR, to Europe, now we've got a horse race. And economists and policymakers got obsessed with this measure until growth became seen as a panacea for any economic ill, be it a budget deficit or unemployment or trade interest rate problem or trade deficit. You need growth to sort this out. In fact, in the 1960s, W.W. Rostow wrote a book called The Stages of Economic Growth. I'm probably very small on the screen, you can't see it, but I have a little first edition copy of it here because I love it so much. It's called The Stages of Economic Growth, a Non-Communist Manifesto. You can smell the politics of it, you see. And Rostow likened the process of economic growth in a country to an airplane ride. He said there are 5 stages. The first one is the traditional society where not very much is happening. Then we have the preconditions for takeoff, where you get the beginnings of a banking system, beginnings of industry setting up, and an education system that trains the students to be workers for the future. And the nation must be touched with a certain nationalism, where people come to believe that growth is good for something beyond itself, like a better life for the future or a strong national identity. And then you have takeoff itself, where growth becomes the normal condition and the march of compound interest begins to bear its blessings. That moves through into the drive for maturity, when you can have any industry you like in your country. You can have a steel industry even if you don't have steel ore. And then it ends up, the 5th stage, in the era of high mass consumption. Well, this airplane ride obviously differs from every other airplane ride in one respect, which is, as things are designed, it can never be allowed to land. Because we have economies today that are financially, politically, and socially addicted to growth. They expect, depend, and demand unending GDP growth. So we're stuck with a growth mentality. Now, Rostow knew that he had left this airplane flying midair. In fact, in his book, he said, and then there's the question beyond, where history offers us only fragments. What to do when the increase in real income itself loses its charm? But he didn't answer his own question, and here's the reason. The year was 1960. He was about to become an advisor to presidential candidate John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy was running on an election ticket of promising 5% growth. So Rostow's job was to keep that plane flying high in the air, not to ask if and how it could ever be allowed to land. So I've taken you on a whirlwind tour of the diagrams at the heart of 20th century economics. And I hope from hearing the caveats, even given by their creators, the blank spaces, the silences, you can see how flawed this theory is. And yet those blank spaces and silences, they give such permission for stories to be created about the economy that we have. And that's exactly what happened, because in April 1947, almost exactly 70 years ago, a small band of economists met in a little Swiss village called Mont Pelerin. Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and others. And they said, we're going to write a new economic story. And they called it neoliberalism. And they had to, their story was motivated by what they saw as the rise of the totalitarian state. And that was a very real threat in their day. They believed that if you give the state an inch, it will take a mile. In fact, it'll take the whole damn lot. So you have to absolutely minimize the role of the state in the economy. Otherwise, it will come to dominate you. That was their driving idea. But their pushback against state totalitarianism that they saw in the USSR very quickly morphed into a market fundamentalism and a conviction that markets should be placed everywhere to push out the state. Their ideas spent decades actually in the back rooms and in memos and in campaign ideas and in think tanks that they seeded. It took a long time until they actually got put on the international stage. And it was actually the rise of Reagan and Thatcher that put them on the stage and turned it into the story we live by. And so we have been living for decades by the neoliberal story, a narrative that stars the market, which is efficient, so we should give it free rein. It stars finance, which is infallible, so we should trust in its ways. It's a story that stars trade, which is win-win, so open your borders. And since every great story has a villain, it stars the state, which is incompetent, so don't let it meddle. These are the stars of the neoliberal story, but of course there are other characters not really needed on stage, but let's meet them anyway. The household is domestic, so you can just leave it to the women. The commons, the tragic. We have heard of the tragedy of the commons. The commons are tragic, so sell them off. Society, as Miss Thatcher said, there is no such thing as society. And so you can ignore it. Earth is inexhaustible, so take all you want. And power, you don't need to talk about power and economics, that's irrelevant. We don't even need to mention it. I believe this story, this narrative that they so carefully constructed on the holes and flaws of neoclassical theory in economics has taken us to the brink of collapse, leaving us today where we are with millions falling short on life's essentials, and we have already overshot planetary boundaries. You care about inequality? Then don't try and redistribute resources. That will block growth, and it's growth that will even things up. You care about the environment? Well, stop your alarmist cries, because actually we believe that it's growth that will clean things up. It's through green growth that we will come to a far cleaner society. We need to grow now and clean up later. I believe we need to turn this story around. And to do that, we need a new economic mindset. And of course, it needs to come with new pictures. So I'm going to tell you now about my idea for putting new pictures at the heart of a 21st century economic story to replace that one I told you of. First of all, what is the first thing that we need to do in economics? We need to have a purpose. So what is economics for? Economics means household management. So I believe in the 21st century, the purpose of economics is to get everybody over the social foundation and come back within the planetary ceiling. Our purpose should be to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. And I think the overriding question of economics is, if that's our goal, what's the economic mindset, the economic ways of thinking, the tools, the techniques, the philosophies, the perspectives that give us the greatest chance of doing this? This has been the driving question at the heart of my book. If humanity's 21st century goal is to get into the donut, what's the economic mindset that gives us the best chance of getting there? So here's my take on that. First lecture in economics, I would not show students supply and demand, because economics is not just the market, and the market isn't in equilibrium. I would show them this picture. It's a new diagram that I've drawn to replace Samuelson's circular flow. It's my new biggest picture of the economy. So what do we see? We see the economy embedded within society and all of its political and cultural institutions, embedded within the living world. And you can see that it's drawing in living matter and materials daily and spewing out waste pollution. Well, right there, you've got the first question of ecological economics, which is, how big can the through flow of materials be into the economy and waste coming out before it begins to disrupt the very earth system processes on which we depend, before we begin to go over planetary boundaries? So we've put ecological economics, which is so often dismissed, at the heart and center of the new diagram. But we also see the economy consists not just in the market and the state, which I believe is a sort of 20th century boxing match, a 20th century Punch and Judy. Are you a free market capitalist, or are you a market-driven socialist or communist? In that boxing match, it's squeezed out space of recognizing two other key sectors: the household, that place of unpaid caring work where all of us, all of you and me, began every day and today. The care that we give to each other, our children, our parents, our family, our neighbors. This is a place where so much of our well-being comes from, and it's not with money changing hands. It's through culture and through connection and community that many of you mentioned. But also the commons, this place where when I say place, it's not a place, it's a way of being together, it's a way of engaging, where we organize ourselves, not using money and markets, not using the state, but community organizing, whether it's to create a community garden on the corner of our block, or to create Wikipedia online, or to create Linux, the world's most powerful operating software. All of these things are created in the commons by communities that choose to come together, set rules for themselves, work together. And in doing so, they steward valuable resources and create resources that they value without money, without the state. The commons has been neglected, and I believe it's going to be resurgent in the 21st century. So this is the first diagram that I would show to economic students. It embeds the economy within living world and life. And of course, there we've got financial flows in the middle. And this makes us ask a question. What would it look like to have a financial system that was in service to the effective operating of those four sectors of the economy, in service to life? I know that I wouldn't want to live in an economy that lacked any one of those four sectors, the household, state, commons, and the market, because I know I've been through every one of them today and I've benefited from all of them today, as I believe have all of you benefited from all of these today. They're wonderfully diverse forms of provisioning, and I think they work best when they work together. The 20th century was a lot about the market and state and public-private partnerships. I think in the 21st century, we're going to see market commons partnerships and state commons partnerships and new forms of enterprise and companies and cooperatives. And I think the commons is going to enrich that debate. What about who we are? We are not rational economic man. We're far more interesting than that. I call it social, adaptable humans. And I've begun to draw some new sketches of the human's portrait. So we have to move from that individualistic me to the community. Not just to the we of my family or even my immediate community. That leaves us othering those who are different from us and leads to all sorts of fragmentation that you're seeing in your country and I'm seeing in mine. We need a global we now, the we of humanity, because this is our shared earth and we need to learn to live well on it together. We are not merely self-interested. We are self-interested, and that's where our competitive streak comes through, but we're also collaborative, cooperative, and socially reciprocating, working with each other to create something that we couldn't create alone. That's what those gymnasts are doing. They're making something together they couldn't create alone. We're not isolated. We're deeply interdependent. We're not work-hating, as Rational Economic Man tells us. I believe actually what we are is purpose-seeking. And the lucky ones are those whose work and purpose comes together. For many, it doesn't come together, but they find other ways of creating work in the commons, in the household, or value in the community that pursues that purpose. And rather than dominant over nature, we are deeply embedded within the web of life. This woman dropping seed into the ground is just a very simple way of showing that interdependence and connection with the soil and the living world on which we depend. And I believe this new portrait of humanity, which of course is being created now by behavioral scientists, by neuroscientists, sociologists, anthropologists, economists, it's the most important portrait that's going to be commissioned this century, because who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. And this will give us a far greater chance of thriving together, 10 billion humans on one planet. How does the economy work? If you never got that joke about why did the chicken cross the road, I'll tell you the real punchline is because it wanted to teach you about systems thinking. It's time to forget Newtonian mechanics and the idea of equilibrium. We need to get into systems and dynamic complexity. So on the screen, you can see this picture of two feedback loops. Let me tell you what's going on there. On the left, you've got a reinforcing feedback loop with two positive signs. There's an R in the middle for reinforcing. And the essence of a reinforcing feedback is this. The more you have, the more you get. So the more chickens you have, the more eggs you get. And the more eggs you have, the more chickens you get. And the more chickens you have, the more eggs you get. And this spirals up, up, up. Or it can also spiral down, down, down. The worse your health, the less your income. The less your income, the worse your health, until you spiral down into a low health, low income poverty trap. So things that spiral up or cascade down are dominated by reinforcing feedback. Most things in the world don't actually survive that way because they either explode or implode. Most things that survive in the world are ultimately balanced by balancing feedback, and that's what's on the right, with a B in the middle for balance. And the essence of that is this. The more you have, the less you get. So the more chickens you have, the more try to cross the road. And the more that try to cross the road, the fewer come back. So our bodies are masterful of balancing feedbacks. When I get hot, my body sweats to try and cool me down. When I get cold, it shivers to warm me up. When I'm hungry, I get this rumbling stomach to eat something. When I'm full, I get that feeling of satiation to stop. Our bodies sustain us thriving healthy because they are masterful with balancing feedbacks. And from your family relationships to the rise and fall of stock markets, to the rise of the 1%, to the collapse of ecosystems, to the incredible flight of a flock of starlings, which is shown on the screen here, a murmuration of starlings. Most of the interesting patterns in the world can be best explained and understood when we think of them in terms of balancing and reinforcing feedbacks. Throw in some delay, throw in some unexpected behavior, and you get the world's most beautiful, incredible patterns, including economic patterns. After the financial crash of 2008, when equilibrium thinking really fell apart, many people went scrabbling back to the work of an economist called Hyman Minsky, who wrote in the 1970s and he had something called the financial instability hypothesis. And it was his understanding of financial systems as being inherently unstable. They're continually spiraling up, then crashing down, then coming up again, then crashing down. If you read the writings of Hyman Minsky, he writes as if he's talking about reinforcing and balancing feedback loops. That's how he understands the world. And I think the biggest mind shift for me after my economics education was when I read Donella Meadows' book, Thinking in Systems. And it was like a great big wake up to realize that this was the mindset that I wanted to equip myself with to best understand the 21st century. So I can recommend that book to you if you're interested in thinking in systems. So economists need to make a career shift, right? Don't be a Charlie Chaplin reaching for the levers of the economy. It's not a mechanism. It's not a machine, and we can't control it. Be more like Josephine Baker here, who's watering her garden. Think of the economy as an ever-evolving system, interactions between human beings that the economist can nurture, shape, and design, but not ultimately control. And if you think that sounds laissez-faire, then you've never actually done a hard day's work in the garden, because gardening and garden design involves a lot of digging and pruning and cutting, moving plants, weeding, tying. It's very interventionist. And so when we design our economic garden, the question is, what do we want to design it for? Well, I believe there are two principles that we need to put at the heart of 21st century economic design. If we are going to create an economy that brings us into the donut, that meets the needs of all within the means of the planet. And those two design principles are to make it distributive and regenerative by design. So distributive by design, what do I mean? I mean an economy in which value that's generated is shared far more equitably with all of those who helped to generate it. Think employee-owned companies, think cooperatives, as that came up already. Think putting your ideas not under patent and copyright, but putting it into Creative Commons, where they can be used again and again and again and improved by a wide community of developers worldwide who are sharing in the knowledge commons these ideas. Think community-owned generation of energy systems, so solar panels on schools, on community buildings, a distributed energy system. Think community currencies that circulate value within a community. All of these are existing everyday examples of distributive design. I also believe, since you're a highly informed community, I already know from our interactions, we're going to go a level deeper, that in my book, what I argue is that the 20th century was redistributive of income, continually redistributing incomes through taxes and minimum wages. That's important, but actually you want to go deeper and pre-distribute the sources of wealth. And some of those key ones are the ownership of land, the ownership of technology, who will own the robots, the ownership of enterprise. This came up earlier with Robert's point about who owns the companies and how can we create companies that are actually owned in a distributive way. Who owns the power to create money? Is it the state? Is it the commercial banks? Is it even a community? So these are some of the fundamental redistributions and pre-distributions of wealth that I believe are needed to create an economy that's distributive by design. What about making it regenerative by design? In this diagram, you can see through the middle of the diagram, the 20th century linear degenerative industrial economy, where we take Earth's materials, make them into stuff we want, use it for a while and then throw it away. And that process, take, make, use, lose, cuts against the living cycles of the Earth. We need to bend those arrows around and create what some people call a circular economy, a cyclical economy, a cradle-to-cradle economy. The principle is that materials are never used up, but are always used again and again and again, separated into biological nutrients, allowing nature to work her own magical course of regenerating and renewing her own materials, but also creating a flow of human materials, whether it's this mouse, my plastic pen, all the materials that are here on my desk, synthetic human-made materials. We need to regenerate and reuse them again and again and again so that we re-embed ourselves in the cycles of life and work with the living processes of life rather than cutting against them as our industries have done. So I believe these principles need to be at the heart of 21st century economics, creating economies that are distributive by design and regenerative by design. This, I think, should be the driving ideas, the ideals, the principles behind policy making, behind our questions as to whether our economy is taking us to where we want to go. Is it becoming more distributive? Is it becoming more regenerative by design? And that takes us, and this is the last of the diagrams I'm going to introduce, that takes us to growth. if we're creating economies that are distributive and regenerative by design, what does that mean for GDP growth, that ideal that was put at the heart of 20th century economics? I believe we need economies that are agnostic about growth. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Step back from economics. In nature, nothing grows forever. Growth is a healthy phase. My children are 8 years old. Their feet are growing very fast. It costs a lot of money in shoes. They're growing taller, and it's wonderful. But at some point, I hope they'll stop growing, because otherwise they will no longer be able to sit at my kitchen table. They would no longer belong in my family. So things grow until they thrive and they belong. Whether it's my children's feet or the Amazon forest, nothing grows forever. It grows until it thrives. And this diagram that you can see, it's called the S-curve. It's very well known to any biologist, anybody studying natural systems, because this is what natural systems do. Isn't it incredible that in economics that we would never countenance this graph? No economist of the mainstream mentality would look at a graph and say, yeah, we're going to have growth and then it's going to come to a rest. And yet the stagnation that's been happening in many economies is actually forcing some economists to confront this possibility. The trouble is today we have economies that need to grow, whether or not they make us thrive, because they've been locked into growth in all the ways that Rostow described. What we need are economies that allow us to thrive without whether or not they grow. But we are locked in through our addictions, financial, political, and social. And let me mention briefly those three. We have economies that have been structured to be addicted to growth financially through the positive return on interest that's at the heart of the financial system, the currencies that we use. Money is issued as debt-bearing interest. It's at the heart of the shareholder-driven model of ownership of business, where shareholders are always pursuing that maximum rate of return, and companies see themselves as holding a fiduciary duty to pursue that over other value. It's at the heart of the political system. This is a picture of the world leaders at the G20 meeting. No leader wants to lose their place in that photo. I call it the G20 family photo. And sometimes it does, like a modern family, change in composition, but no leader wants to lose their place. But to keep their place, they need to keep their economy growing, because if they don't, they'll be elbowed out by the next emerging powerhouse. So this is one of the mothers of all collective action problems. How do we create a system of global governance that doesn't depend on every economy continuing to grow to keep up with its neighbors that's continuing to grow? Lastly, we're socially addicted to growth. Thanks to a century of consumerist propaganda created by the nephew of Sigmund Freud, a man called Edward Bernays, he realized that his uncle's psychotherapy was an extremely lucrative route to creating an addiction to retail therapy. And he managed to understand if he connected our deepest values of feeling secure, feeling loved, feeling respected, if he could make us believe that we would feel those things if we bought a new car, a new jacket, a new shampoo, then he was onto something great. And he's created this consumerism in which we've been convinced that we transform ourselves by buying something more. Now, these financial, political, and social addictions, I don't think that any one of them is insurmountable, but they all deserve far, far more attention than they currently get if we are to create an economy that can be agnostic about growth, that allows us to thrive whether or not it's growing. So we need to come off Rostow's airplane. We don't want to fly forever into the sunset, but we don't want to land the plane. What I believe we need to do, funny though it sounds, is to become kite surfers. Now, a kite surfer has a surfboard, which works with the movement of the waves, goes up and down with the waves, and they have a kite, which responds to the wind. And the way that the surfer holds their balance, makes progress across the waves and the sea, is with a bar in the middle, which they pull up and down in response to the movement of the wind and the waves. So that bar is going up and down as they move with the wind and the waves. I think that's a really nice metaphor for the future of GDP. GDP is the value of goods and services sold in the economy, and it should go up and down in response to our movement to becoming an economy that's regenerative and distributive by design. I'll give you one example. China is investing $360 billion by 2020, that's 3 years' time, in investing in solar energy capacity. So that's going to be a huge boost to China's GDP as that energy capacity goes in. The technology, the investment, the labor, big boost to GDP. But once it's in, the cost of generating electricity becomes near zero marginal cost. So it's no longer contributing to GDP. So you've got a massive boost and then a fall off as China moves towards having a regenerative, renewable energy system. That's a nice example of GDP becoming a response variable to too much bigger driving principles of regenerative and distributive design. So let me pull out. I'm winding up here. I know I've been talking a long time. I get excited when I talk about economics, and I apologize. But I'm going to wind up. Here's my pitch of a new narrative for 21st century economics. It's a story that stars Earth first. She's the first protagonist because she is life-giving. So we should respect her boundaries. It's a story that stars society because society is foundational. As Ashley said, community, sense of community. I agree, Ashley. Society is foundational. So let's nurture our connections. It stars the household, which is core. It's where we began today and every day. So we must value the contribution of the unpaid care economy. It also stars the market because the market is powerful, but we must embed it wisely. It stars the commons because they are extraordinarily creative, especially now that we have the digital commons. So let's unleash their potential. It stars the state, which is essential. So let's make it accountable. Good luck in America. We're trying our best over here too on that one, by the way. The new story stars finance, which is in service. So how do we make finance serve society? It stars business because it's innovative. And I'm going to take that word away. Earlier, the Jay said, do we have to call it business? Let's call it enterprise. It stars enterprise because when people come together and create an enterprise, it's innovative, whether it's a co-op or a company. So let's give it purpose. But what business model, what form of value and ownership and financing of enterprise will allow us to give it purpose? That's the question. It stars trade because the trade is double-edged, so we have to make it fair. And lastly, the new economic story stars power. We have to talk about power because it's pervasive, and we must learn to check its abuse. I believe that's the beginning of a new economic story. And as I told you at the beginning, I think the most powerful stories are told with pictures. So I want to write over the 20th century diagrams with these new images of 21st century economics. And if you agree with me about the power of pictures, then you might like these. I've had the chance to work with some of the world's best stop motion animators, telling the story of the 7 ways to think like a 21st century economist in my book, each one in just 60 seconds flat. So these are animations about changing the goal, nurturing human nature, create to regenerate. I hope if you go on my website and watch them, they make you laugh, they make you think, they make you filled with awe, because I think we can bring emotion, humor, wonder back into economics and reanimate economics. If you like them, share them on social media, teach with them, ask your teachers to use them to prompt conversation, because I think we can reanimate economics for the 21st century. And lastly, before I close off, if you want a condensed of what I've said, if you like it academic style, there's a journal article I published in the Lancet Planetary Health, which is about planetary health and human health. It's a very snappy little introduction to the Doughnut concept with all the data behind it. If you like political journalism, the journalist, George Monbiot, I don't have to tell you George Monbiot is. You know George Monbiot. He wrote an article about it that does a really nice example of telling the story of why this new paradigm is needed. Let me wrap up there and say I very much look forward to discussing with you guys now. So, and anything you ask me doesn't have to be a question, comment. I love critique. Give me critique because it makes it better. Let's construct a 21st century economy together. Thank you.
Kate, I want to come back to the question I raised earlier.
Yeah.
Overwhelmingly, most of the world economy is composed of huge corporations.
Yep.
This model that you put forward is very abstract. It sounds very good, but it doesn't seem to me to deal with the fact that these corporations are destroying the world, and what do we do about them? It's all very nice to talk about an abstract economy in the future and how we could control it, but first of all, I don't see how we can control it unless we own it. Society needs to take, these corporations need to be publicly held. They need to be owned by society, because that's the only way society can actually determine what they make or don't make. We need to close down many large corporations, ExxonMobil, Land Rover, British Airways, United Airlines, General Motors, because all of these companies and many, many more are just destroying the planet with their incredible overproduction of commodities designed to be obsolesced and replaced all over again next year and so forth. So I just don't see that your model deals with that, with the corporate economy that is presently most of the world. What do we do about that? Thank you.
Great. Okay. Let me see if I got my slides here. Hang on a second. Sorry, I've just took that off. Oh, I've gone back to the beginning. Sorry, hang on a second. Have I got my, oh, I'm sorry. So I often have corporate slides here. I took them off because I didn't know we were going to talk about companies. I absolutely agree with you. These companies are not companies that can get us into the donut. And a meta point first. Yes, what I'm presenting is abstract, and it doesn't immediately tell you the answers. And the reason I do that is because I want to create a framework that then allows us to ask, okay, what kind of cities, what kind of enterprise, what kind of communities will help bring us here? So I agree with you that the companies that we have today do not bring us into this space. And for me, the question is how, so these an enterprise needs to be running its business in a way that is distributive and regenerative by design. It needs to be working in what people call a circular economy. It needs to be distributive of the value that's generated within that enterprise. We can all think of examples of companies that do that, whether it's a cooperative, an employee-owned company, an organization making solar panels is part of that story. Cleveland, Ohio co-ops, cooperatives in Tanzania, examples I could tell you from all over the world. You know the kinds that I'm talking about that actually help bring us into this place. For me, the fundamental question is not what you're making or how you're behaving in your supply chain. The fundamental question is what allows you to be that kind of enterprise. And I think it comes down to three factors. One, how you're purposed. Two, how you're owned. And three, how you're financed. So at the heart of enterprise that is, let me say, helping bring us into the donut, those enterprises are enterprises that have clear purpose. What Marjorie Kelly, who's written a wonderful book about this called Owning Our Future, Marjorie Kelly calls living purpose. So let me say 20th century corporations, the kind you're referring to, I would say they have financial purpose. Their purpose is to maximize shareholder returns, to maximize profit. That's no use. That is never going to get us there. We need companies with living purpose, whose purpose is actually to create a renewable energy system, to contribute to the community. There are a lot of entrepreneurs and innovators now who we know who are creating companies that are exactly focused around that. And they are turning a fair return and a profit at the same time. That is possible. So one, having a purpose at the heart of your mission. Two, how are you owned? I absolutely agree that companies that are currently owned in the shareholder model will not get there because shareholding precludes that kind of wider purpose because it's a narrow purpose. Employee owned, cooperatively owned, these kinds of organizations start getting us there. Also peer-to-peer, I think the rise of the commons, peer-to-peer partnerships where a lot of the value of the enterprise isn't owned by the enterprise, but actually is in the knowledge commons. So it's about market commons collaborations that I was talking about earlier. I think these are business models that help bring us into this space. And third, it's deeply connected with how it's financed. Again, the old 20th century corporation is driven by financial purpose. It's owned by shareholders, and therefore it's financed by shareholders. It's not going to get us there. It's the wrong model. We need a model which is financed either by, it can be financed by those who own the company, employee owned. It can be financed by issuing a green bond, going to an ethical bank. There's all sorts of interesting new financing mechanisms that are coming through to enable this new kind of business. So that's my view about what kind of enterprise can actually help bring us into this space. And I absolutely agree. There are many companies and corporations in the world that, because of the way they're valued, owned, and financed, can't be part of this solution.
Hi, Kate. My name's Everett, and I'm a part of the student group. I have a question about your idea of the commons and why that plays such an important role in this theory that you have. Thank you.
Say one more thing. What is it that you don't understand the way I'm presenting
I don't,
it, or
yeah.
you're doubting that, or you're just interested? Just
Well,
help me answer the question well a bit more.
Okay, so yeah, I just I'm confused on your your interpretation of it, because when you first talked about it, I think about the commons as more of like a labor, or that group of people that is organized as labor, and I'm confused of what you specifically mean by the commons.
Okay, thank you. That's a really helpful clarification. Let me give you an example. Linus Torvald sat in his student room one day and started writing a new kind of operating system, and he said he was just doing it for fun, but he put it open source on the internet, and other people started contributing to it, and it became what's now known as Linux, which is the world's most widely used and most well-regarded operating system. I would say that's an excellent example of something extremely valuable, dynamic, and useful being created in the commons. So it was created in the commons in the sense that a community of people came together, self-selecting. They were those who knew how to code and who wanted to contribute to this product, to this project. They often worked for free. You know, it's a classic case of people who do a day job and then rush home and work until 3 o'clock in the morning contributing to this project, because we are inspired to contribute to something that has purpose beyond ourselves and to use our skills and to get recognition for that. So many people contribute for free. There's a very clear community amongst those creating Linux about how you do the coding, who corrects, who manages it. So they've got very clear community rules. They steward that resource very well, and it's turned into a rival for other operating systems. I think the CEO of IBM once called it a cancer, and now actually they use it themselves. So to me, this is a great example of the commons. Another example is the Open Building Institute, which is based in Missouri, I believe. They are designing low-cost, energy efficient, highly insulated houses that could be built from local materials available anywhere in the world. They put all the designs on the web. Those designs are then tried and tested by communities all over the world who feed back, this worked, this didn't work, we've added this innovation, that worked. So you've got a global R&D team working on a common design. And they're creating a fantastic free blueprint of how to build a 21st century house for low cost that could be built and adapted to any community worldwide. To me, that's a great example of the commons at work, a community of practitioners who come together, contributing their skills, creating something far greater than themselves. So I think thanks to the digital technology that's allowing us to talk right now, but also that allows this repository of knowledge, the global knowledge commons is going to see a huge resurgence this century. Not always naturally and easily, though. It will always be pressured and fought by corporations who want to colonize and privatize that information. So there's an ongoing battle between proprietary knowledge and the commons. But there's a wonderful community of people who are contributing to the commons, defending it and expanding it and showing how valuable it is. I think it needs to be invested in by the state, though, to protect its space, but also to create maker communities, to create commons platforms where people could contribute to that worldwide, because I think it's a knowledge for all of humanity. Does that make more sense in terms of me talking about the commons and why I think it's valuable?
Yeah, definitely. Those examples really help. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, Kate, we're going to cut it off at 3 more questions. Everyone wants to keep talking to you, but we've got 3.
And I'm sorry, and I realize I talked for too long. I really apologize.
No, it's incredible. You're spending so much time. So 3 more? Okay.
Absolutely. I'm here.
All right.
Hi, Kate. My name is Brianna. I am a part of the student group as well. I have a question for you, and I'm not quite sure how I'm going to word it, but I'm going to try. So the question I have for you is, many of us are graduated seniors, and some of us are heading off to college next year, and we will likely have to take an economics course of some sort. And after this information you have presented to us, I think we might be sort of underwhelmed with the information we're presented with in one of those classes, especially because the professors, as you mentioned, as you study economics, you become more and more self-interested. So how can we start the conversation with those professors to sort of open their minds without making them feel destabilized because they've likely devoted much of their lives to studying an outdated model?
That is a most excellent question, not only for you raising it, but also for the sensitivity with which you placed it. To thinking of the people who you're going to be challenging what they're teaching. And let me say something about those professors that actually, when I speak to economics professors, many of them say, damn, I'm frustrated by the syllabus too. You know, I know this isn't right, but this is the syllabus and our students are going to get graded on this and I need my students to pass exams, so I have to teach them this. And many of them will say, I teach them these main theories. Of course I teach them the caveats and I teach them the shortcomings because I want them to know the alternative. But the trouble is, because we've never created a new synthesis, an alternative whole view of economics, the old economics still stands. And some will say, well, there's no alternative, so this is the only thing we have to teach. So I teach it, and then I teach the problems and the shortfalls, but then they go back to teaching it. So what the education you get is an education in what's wrong with the economics you've just been taught, which isn't a very useful way of framing it. What can you do? Right, great. One, I think, have courage. Put your hand up and question when, for example, if you're taught the circular flow diagram, say, where is the living world? Why would the biggest diagram in economics we show not show the planet on which we depend and we fundamentally depend? Why does it only show monetary flows? So have confidence in your questioning. Two, to bolster that confidence, I would say join the international student movement, which is called Rethinking Economics, which is students in countries all over the world who, like me and like yourself, are questioning the economics that you're going to be taught. And they are demanding a pluralist economics education. So they're saying, okay, teach us the neoclassical stuff. Also teach us many, many different other perspectives. We want to learn ecological economics, feminist economics, institutional economics, complexity economics. Trust us to have the wisdom to choose which kind of economics we think is the right one to use in any circumstance. So rethinking economics, I strongly recommend it to any of you. It's open to students, but also to anybody who's passionate about rewriting economics. And thirdly, I'd say, show them some of the animations from my videos and put them in as a challenge. Be playful with your professors. Yes, in some cases, their egos may be at stake. Their careers have been built on this, and indeed their mindsets are very locked in to understanding it. And they find it hard to see the world any other way. When I presented at the World Bank, the senior economist there said, one of them said, I set out reading your book determined to hate it. And actually I found myself enjoying it. But of course, what you're talking about is externalities. So they'll use their framing to explain away the critique you bring. Some will do that. Others will be absolutely desperate to have students like you turn up and join them in challenging the system because they also want to make the challenge. So listen respectfully to where that professor is coming from and see how much you can work with them and how much you need to challenge them. But go forth with confidence.
Thank you.
I just want to offer, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Adbusters campaign about...
Yeah, I grew up on Adbusters.
Okay.
When I moved to New York working for the UN, Adbusters was the best thing that happened to me.
So I just wanted to share kind of in relation to that, back to Brianna and all the other students. There was a great campaign. It was called Kick It Over. And it was part of the meme wars that Adbusters was doing and encouraging students to take campuses and take back their classrooms and to challenge professors. And they even give sort of like a playbook of how you could go in there and challenge them, ask them questions, hang posters, and they have this manifesto to stop teaching the economics that she's talking about as if it's some sort of written law. So it's really awesome.
So just before we go on, Jay, so if any of you get a chance to read my book, I hope you'll be pleased to find that on page 3 is a photograph. Can you see that?
Yeah.
From the Kick It Over campaign. And so I start the book writing about the economics students movement and how they're rebelling against what they're taught, and the Kick It Over guys who projected onto the Sheraton Hilton when it was the Economics Association annual conference, economic growth is killing the planet, and threw all these professors into complete ski whiff because they'd never had anything like this happen to them before. So it's wonderful when the world of activism meets the very old world of economics.
Thank you.
Hi, Kate. My name's Bonnie, and I was just thinking back to our activity that we did, thinking about the 8 greatest factors that affect us getting the donut. And I was just curious to hear your thoughts on what is maybe the greatest factor or some of the greatest factors that are preventing specifically climate change from going into the donut.
Ooh, the greatest factor. It's one of these things that you want to stack at so many different levels. And I suppose there's the long term and then there's the immediate. I'm going to give both. At the long term, I think, and I have a bias, right? We all are biased where we're coming from. And my bias is that it's that diagram, the circular flow diagram, that for nearly 70 years, economics has drawn the biggest picture of the economy floating free, ignoring the living world. If we're going to talk about the living world in terms of externalities, you've already told me it's peripheral. So I put a lot of blame at the door of economics. And I know it's just one discipline, but man, it's the discipline that frames the way policy is done, the media discuss. So economics has told us it's peripheral and we can dismiss it as externality. That's the big long view. But come to the immediate, I'm going to go back to what Robert said because I agree with him. It's the power between companies that are deeply invested in the fossil fuel money that they've been making for centuries and their extraordinary complicit relationships with politics and their ability to tie that up so neatly. That is the near-term immediate threat. And because we know we have a very short amount of time, I'm going to put that one first, right? So it's against a background that allows politicians, Trump can say, you know, I don't believe in climate change. He needs to dismiss it off to focus on he wants 4% growth. And he says, we need to worry about local air and water pollution, but don't forget that economic growth enhances environmental protection. That's what he tweeted on Earth Day. Economic growth enhances environmental protection. He's invoking the upside down Kuznets curve on environment. So old economics allows politicians to get away with false stories that justify their relationships with corporations that are continuing to profit from this. That's my answer.
Thank you.
Hi, Kate. My name is Kyle.
Hi there.
I just want to say I first heard about your work when I was abroad in New Zealand, actually, with a professor, Bronwyn Hayward, and I just want to say since then it's helped me rethink, or it helped me start rethinking economics in a lot of ways. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to ask. So might be mixing up a few things because we read a lot of articles, but thinking through some of what you had written about donut economics, there was a commentary, I think, tying how poverty can actually feed into a lot of our environmental problems, like with burning a forest and things like that. And I was wondering if you could talk just a little about that.
Yeah, you're not mixing things up. You're just showing that you've read widely and way back. So I wrote a paper in 2012, which was the original Oxfam discussion paper that I wrote, which launched the donut when it was just this picture that was the time that it had sudden resonance, and I realized the power of pictures. And in that, I talk, as I was early talking about spaghetti, and I was saying if you're wanting to draw lines on this donut picture, then let me go back. If you're wanting to draw lines on the donut, then you've got the right idea. Let me go to here. So and I was trying to show that the interdependencies of wealth and poverty can put pressure depending on the dynamics. So let's say there are people here falling short on energy, right? Look in the middle of that donut. People falling short on energy. They don't have access to electricity. They don't have access to clean cooking fuels. What do? They go and collect firewood from the local forest. Women spend up to 8 hours a day carrying firewood and water. And of course, they need to cook food. Many of the grains they're using have to be cooked. That's the only way they can prepare food for their families. So they need firewood, or they buy charcoal. If they've got cash, they'll buy charcoal, which has been transformed from firewood. So when communities don't have any alternative access to energy, yes, they can end up depleting the forests around them, which shows the interconnectedness of getting everybody out of poverty and reducing our pressure on the environment. Of course, it can go the other way, that when you get people have such high incomes and their lifestyles are very affluent, then again, their impact on the environment can kick in all sorts of different ways. They start jetting around and going off on holidays to Thailand. And so the relationship isn't linear. It's very complex. And it goes back to all the things we were talking about, technology and governance and community and aspiration. But does that begin to explain what I was meaning about some of the interconnections between when people are living in poverty, they are sometimes forced through sheer emergency of circumstance to deplete the environment on which they understand they depend.
Yeah, that got it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
This is going to be our last question.
Okay.
I don't know if I could get this off here. So, my name is Claudia, and I have a question. Early on, you said, I'll make this real quick because I know we're running out of time, that we have converted too much of Earth's surface out of a natural condition. And right now, you've been to Montana. I'm really happy about that. And so you know how much wildlands we have. But one of the things that we're looking at is trying to preserve as much of our wildlands as possible. And there's a lot of pressure by many, many different users. And I kind of like to know a good economic argument to present to our forest planners. And I'm talking about all the forests in Montana are either in revision or pending to be in revision. So this is really an important prospect for us.
Okay, so I'm not going to have a really neat answer for you, but I completely understand what you're asking. And ultimately, I would say what matters, the question you want to answer is, what is the mindset of your forest planners? Whether they're forest planners, whether they're corporations, whether they're the Ministry of Finance, who is it in power who you are engaging with? Because what is going to persuade them? And that, you know, do they see beyond financial value? So if you're trying to present, if they're motivated by the financial value of forests, then you're in a tricky position, because the 20th century mindset is dominated by the idea of how much value can we extract from this. And I believe the 21st century mindset is how many benefits can we layer into this place that it can be generous and generative. And there's a great big culture clash going on between the two of those. Sometimes people in your situation have to resort to expressing environmental value as ecosystem services and natural capital, and putting a monetary value on it to speak that language of power. I know some people do that, and it can help win that particular battle. Sometimes it also can lose the war, because we're increasingly expressing the value of community in the living world in a financialized way, which increases the power of the economic mindset and the economic calculation. So I'm personally wary of doing that. At the same time, if you're speaking, I could hear the urgency in your voice, not just because we're running out of time, but because this is an urgent question in Montana. And so sometimes you need to choose to speak that language of power and to use their language, even though it grates against your values, to frame it that way. I would turn to Janine. I don't know if you know the work of Janine Benyus. Yeah. In fact, she lives near you guys, doesn't she?
Yeah, she does.
She does. See, my book was deeply inspired by Janine, and her ability to express poetically, humanly, but also deeply in an informed way, the value of the landscape, the way it sequesters carbon, the way it stores water, the interdependence of that landscape on all of those around. I would try and bring her on your side and say, how do we protect our forests and allow them to flourish in a way that we can reap value for the community, that people see the social value, that the environmental value is contributing to a bigger mindset in the country. Like I said, I don't have a neat answer for you, but I'm just going to go back to the beginning, which is what you're really up against is the mindset that the forest planners are bringing. And if it's this 20th century extractive mindset of how much value can we extract from this, do they see timber or do they see the ecosystem thriving? And how do you engage with that? Do you end up having to reinforce its existing power, or can you speak to a wider mindset? So I'm not going to pretend sitting in my little Oxford office that I have an answer for Montana. But I think the language we use and the pictures we draw can deeply speak to the mindset and help to reframe them.
Thank you very much.
All right, Kate, I'm going to have the students come up and I'll say hi to you and say some thank you. So they're going to come up and you get a chance to see the whole group, okay?
Oh, wow, okay. Is that a stretch or a wave?
It was a stretch and kind of a wave.
I want to know, before we have to sign up, I want to know what was the conversation where this conference began, what was said, and where did somebody say, I know, let's do, how did it happen? Where did it come from?
So last year in May, we held a conference at a local theater on indigenous resistance movements. And one of the speakers there we had was Noam Chomsky. And Noam Chomsky brought up the point that climate change was a threat that was going to affect our generation, or the greatest threat that was going to affect our generation. And so that kind of got the wheels in our heads turning, and now we're here today.
Great. Well, and I think the way you've done it is brilliant. And I'm also just going to acknowledge what I was speaking about, the way I was presenting. I wasn't talking specifically about climate change, but I hope you could see how it was a very important, embedded in a mindset shift and a very important part of that whole.
Yes, yeah, we did. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much, Kate. Very generous of you to give all your time to us. And I would just like to hope that we can collaborate again in the future, maybe with a student group, because I'm sad to see all these kids going. They're all graduating and leaving. I gotta start over again. So I think you'll be one of the first people that they'll want to call, and I really appreciate that. And yeah, any opportunity to do something like this again would be great.
I'd love to. Let me just say finally. So as I said, I'm a mother of twins. And I need to be here. I need to be a mother as well as speaking about these issues. So this kind of chance is fantastic. In fact, what I've been thinking is I was going to, before you guys contacted me, I was going to write on Twitter, look, if you want me to give a talk, I'll send you a video to watch first. Then let's have an hour together, and I'll do a video talk to any university anywhere in the world, because this is what I want to do, and I want to do it without flying. But you guys came to me with the same idea, and so I'm so impressed by what you're doing. I think what you should do, one thing you could do, would be to write up where the idea came from, how you did it, what the hitches were, what didn't work, what did work, and post that to other, this would be your contribution to the knowledge commons, how to run a low carbon, high intensity conference online with people from all over the world, because what you've invented here is fantastic and should be done far, far more often. So you could offer that to others to learn from your example, and they'll come back with more, and before you know it, you've started a knowledge commons, and you together are reinventing the conference for the 21st century.
Right on. You like it? All right.
So going off your last point, on behalf of the group, we just wanted to tell you that one of our goals for the symposium was to create what we are calling critical thinking communities. And so when we're done Skyping with you, we'll send you a link to an animation, because we know you love those, that one of our students made describing what we hope critical thinking communities will do for the future. So make sure you look at that, please.
I'd love to. And also, if you do put something on the web, I don't know whether you're going to put the videos on the web or something, but if there's something that I can then tweet to the world later to help amplify people's knowledge of what you've done or what resources you've created, please let me know, and I would be very happy to do that.
We'll send you the link to our website as well, and we'll let you do with that what you please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, great, pleasure.
And one other thing, we 2 days ago we met with Derek Jensen, and he's agreed to interview the students on Resistance Radio, so that's going to be really exciting for them. And yesterday we asked George to maybe mention us in an article about what we're doing here. So anything that you put out really helps their movement and their work here. So thank you.
I will certainly look for chances to do that.
All
I
right.
will do. Congratulations. Kudos to you all. Bye.